The dawn came up thin and gray over Redemption Gulch, the kind of light that made the dust in the street look like ash, settled after a fire long since burned out. And at that hour the wheelwright walked the same worn path he had walked every morning for weeks now, past the darkened windows of the mercantile, past the hitching post where no horse yet stood, to the bench that sat beneath the store's overhang, like something forgotten there on purpose. She was already seated when he arrived, as she always was, her hands folded in her lap and her bonnet tied close against a wind that had not yet decided to blow, and he lowered himself down beside her without a word, the boards groaning once beneath his weight, before settling into the same silence they had settled into every dawn before this one. The town did not sit beside her. That much had become plain to him within his first week in Redemption Gulch, watching the way the churchwomen drew their skirts a fraction closer when she passed, the way the mercantile's owner counted her coins twice and slid her goods across the counter as though reluctant to let his fingers linger near hers. 2 husbands buried in 3 years had a way of following a woman through a town like smoke follows a wind, settling into corners, staining the air long after the fire itself had gone cold. And nobody in Redemption Gulch had troubled themselves to say aloud what they believed, though their silence said it plainly enough. She carried something. Nobody wanted to catch it. He had arrived 8 months before with little enough of his own to make him proud, a toolbox worn smooth at the corners from years of handling, a discharge paper folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, and a wound of a different kind that no paper could account for, the kind a man carried home from war only to find the woman he'd meant to marry already wearing another man's ring. He had come west because there was nowhere east worth the fare, and he had taken a room above the livery because it was cheap and because the liveryman did not ask questions he had no wish to answer. He had set up his forge and his wheel jig in the shed behind it, and within a month the town had discovered, grudgingly, that his hands knew iron and wood better than most men's hands knew their own wives. But knowing his skill and knowing him were different matters, and Redemption Gulch was slow to extend the second where the first had already been granted. So he sat each morning beside the one person in town nobody else would sit beside, and he said nothing, because there was nothing yet worth saying, and because some things, he had learned, were better proven by staying than by speaking at all. The stage had left him standing in a street he did not recognize, with a trunk of tools he could barely lift, and $11 folded into a boot he had not taken off in 3 days. And the first thing he noticed about Redemption Gulch was not the heat, though the heat was considerable, nor the dust, though the dust rose in a fine yellow scrim over everything the wind touched, but the way the men on the boardwalk looked at him and then looked away, the particular indifference of a town that had already decided it had enough hands and did not need another. He had asked at the feed store first, because a man with tools ought to start with what he knew, and the proprietor had told him, not unkindly, that there was no work for a stranger in a place where every son and nephew already had a claim on what little there was. He had asked at the smithy, and the smith, a heavy man with soot in the creases of his knuckles, had looked at his soft eastern boots and said the same in fewer words. By the third refusal he had stopped asking and started looking, because looking cost nothing, and a man who had survived 4 years of war on less than $11 knew that the difference between starving and eating was often only a matter of seeing what others had overlooked. What he found, behind the livery, was a lean-to shed with a dirt floor and a broken axle propped against one wall like a monument to somebody's abandoned intentions, and when he asked the liveryman what he wanted for it, the liveryman, who was tired of tripping over the axle and had no use for the space himself, said he would take labor instead of coin, since coin was plainly not a thing the stranger possessed in any quantity worth mentioning. So it was that Gideon Marsh came to own, if owning was the word for a debt paid in sweat, a shed with a dirt floor and a broken axle, and it was there that he unpacked his forge and his wheel jig and his father's tools, laying them out on a length of canvas the way another man might lay out his family Bible, because they were, in their way, the only inheritance he had left that anyone could not take from him with a signature or a broken promise. He slept that first week on the canvas itself, beneath the shelf where the tongs hung, and ate what the liveryman's wife spared him in exchange for mending her porch step, and told himself that a man who had marched through Georgia on parched corn could certainly survive a Texas summer on pride alone. It was not until the second week, when a rancher's wagon came in with a shattered wheel and no one else in town willing to fix it before the week's end, that Redemption Gulch discovered, with visible reluctance, that the stranger's hands were worth more than his silence had suggested. The wheel that finally proved him came from a rancher named Hollis, but it was the wheel that came 3 days later, cracked clean through the felloe and lashed with baling wire to keep it turning at all, that Gideon would remember longer, because it arrived behind a mule driven by a woman in a gray dress, who did not look at him when she spoke, only at the wheel, as though the wheel were the only party to the transaction worth her attention. "I was told you mend these," she said. "I do." "How much, and how long?" He walked around the wagon once, slow, the way he walked around anything before he touched it, running 2 fingers along the crack the way another man might feel for a fever in a child's forehead, and she watched him do it without impatience, which he noted, because most people who brought him broken things wanted to tell him how they broke, as if the story mattered more than the mending. She offered no story. She stood in the shade of the shed's overhang with her hands folded in front of her apron and waited. 2 days, he said. $1.25 if you bring your own grease. I'll bring the grease. She paid him then, before the work was done, 3 coins counted into his palm, without ceremony, and when he opened his mouth to say that custom was to pay after, she said, "I know the custom," in a voice that closed the matter, and he understood, watching her walk back toward the mule, that she had learned somewhere that men in this town liked excuses to renegotiate with her once the wheel was already off its axle and her leverage gone, and that she had decided never to give anyone that chance again. The shopkeeper's wife happened to be crossing to the mercantile at that hour with a basket of eggs, and she paused long enough on the boardwalk to watch the exchange with an expression that suggested she had seen a thing she meant to repeat over supper, though what precisely offended her, the widow paying full price, or the wheelwright taking it without haggling her down out of some obligation to share in the town's low opinion of her, Gideon could not have said, and did not ask. He had marched under men who looked at him that way, and he had learned that a stare cost nothing to ignore. He worked on the wheel that evening after the shop had gone quiet, setting the fellow true in the jig by lamplight because the crack ran deeper than the wire had let on, and he found himself taking more care with the spokes than the $1.25 strictly required, not because he expected more coin for it, but because it seemed to him a poor sort of man who would do careless work simply because no one was standing over him to see it done well. The fever that took him had come in August, when the wheat stood shoulder high and green enough to promise a fair harvest, and it had taken him quickly, in the manner of fevers that arrive without warning and depart only after they have finished their business. She had nursed him through 11 days of it, changing the linens herself, because no neighbor woman would come sit with a household that had already lost one man to a fall from a half-broken horse 2 years before. and by the time the doctor rode out from town, it was only to confirm what she already knew from the color of his lips and the way his breath had gone shallow and irregular as a stream running dry in September. He was buried on a Thursday beside the first husband, in a plot she had paid for herself out of egg money and mending fees, and the preacher had said the words that preachers said, about the Lord's will and the comfort of the faithful, though she noted that none of the faithful lingered afterward to offer their arms or their casseroles the way they had done for the widow Hastings when her husband died of the same fever not 3 weeks later. It was the second death within 3 years that seemed to settle something in the town's collective mind, as if grief were a debt that accrued interest the longer it went unpaid, and she was the one now owing. The whispers did not arrive all at once. They arrived the way frost arrives, first at the edges of things, a pew left empty beside her at church where before someone might have crowded in without complaint, a merchant's ledger that seemed to total her purchases a nickel or two higher than her neighbor's identical basket, a silence that fell over conversations when she entered the mercantile that had not fallen before. No one said the word aloud in her hearing, not for months, though she heard it eventually from a child too young to know better, repeating what an aunt had said over supper, and she had gone home that evening and sat a long while at her table with her hands folded before she managed to eat anything at all. She did not blame them entirely. She had grown up in a country where women traded superstitions the way men traded horses, where a black cat or a broken mirror carried weight enough to alter a day's plans, and she understood, in some cold corner of her mind, how 2 funerals within 3 years might look to people who needed an explanation for misfortune that did not implicate the fever itself, or the hard land, or the simple indifference of Providence. But understanding a thing and forgiving it were not the same exercise, and she had stopped expecting forgiveness from Redemption Gulch long before a wheelwright with a soldier's bearing sat down on the bench beside her, as though he had not heard a word of what they said. The bench itself belonged to no one, set outside the mercantile by some forgotten proprietor years before either of them had come to Redemption Gulch, its boards silvered and split by seasons of sun, and yet by the second week of that late summer it had become, without either of them saying so, a fixture as reliably theirs as a pew claimed by long habit in a church. He arrived each morning within the same quarter hour, his boots dusted from the walk down from the livery, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee he had learned to make strong and unsweetened, the way she took it, though she had never told him this outright. She had simply not added sugar the first time he offered, and he had watched her drink it without complaint, and had made note of it the way he made note of the grain in a piece of oak before he cut it. They spoke little at first, and what they said carried the plainness of people unaccustomed to being listened to. He mentioned the heat, or the state of a wheel he had trued the day before, or the price of iron nails at the hardware. She answered in kind, telling him once that her wheat stood taller than it had the year before, another time that a hen had gone broody on eggs that would not hatch. Neither of them reached toward anything larger than these small facts, and yet the accumulation of them, morning upon morning, built something neither had architecture enough to name. The town watched, as the town always watched. Women paused with baskets on their arms at the mercantile door, their eyes cutting sideways before they remembered themselves and went in. Men loitering near the livery exchanged looks that required no words, the sort of looks passed between people who believed they understood a thing and felt no urgency to revise the understanding. She had grown practiced at not seeing this, and he, for his part, seemed constitutionally incapable of caring what an audience made of him, a trait she suspected the war had carved into him alongside whatever else it had taken. Some mornings he brought a small repair with him, a hinge, a buckle, a broken awl handle, and worked at it with his knife while they sat, not because the work demanded doing there, but because his hands seemed unwilling to sit idle even when the rest of him had settled. She found she did not mind the silence this created between sentences. It was a different silence than the one the town gave her, which was empty and pointed. His was simply full, the way a held breath is full, waiting on nothing more than the next thing worth saying. It was in this rhythm, undisturbed and unremarkable to any eye but their own, that the last week of August arrived, dry and close, carrying with it a stranger's coach dust, visible from a long way off down the road that led into Redemption Gulch. The dust would resolve itself into a coach by afternoon, but that was hours off yet, and in the meantime his mind had already gone backward, the way it did sometimes without asking permission, to a porch in Tennessee where he had once stood in a uniform 3 sizes too loose from campaign rations, holding a letter he had read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. He had been gone 2 years by then, first to drill and then to the long grinding middle of the war where nothing moved except columns of men and the slow arithmetic of loss, and she had written faithfully for the first year, her hand growing looser and more hurried as the second wore on, until the letters thinned to nothing at all. He had told himself it was the mail, the disrupted lines, the general collapse of everything a war touches. He had gone on believing this through a winter of frozen boots and a spring of burying men he had known since boyhood, and when he came home at last, hollowed out and slow-moving, it was to find her married 8 months to a dry goods merchant, with soft hands and a shop that had never once been called to defend anything. She had not written to tell him. He had learned it from a neighbor woman on the road into town, delivered without malice, as simple fact, the way one might mention a bridge washed out, or a well gone dry. He remembered standing in the road a long while after she had passed on, not from grief exactly, though there was grief in it, but from the particular vertigo of discovering that the self he had preserved through 2 years of horror, the one who had a home and a woman waiting in it, had been fictional the entire time he was preserving it. He had not raged. Rage required a belief that things ought to have gone otherwise, and the war had already relieved him of most such beliefs. What he had felt instead, and what he still carried now, sitting on a bench beside a woman the town had quietly agreed to be afraid of, was a colder and more durable thing, a recognition that people would set you aside for their own comfort and call it practical, and that the only dignity available to the one set aside was in how he chose to stand afterward. He had chosen, that year, not to become the kind of man who added weight to another person's aloneness merely because his own had never been lifted. It was not forgiveness, exactly, what he felt toward the dry goods merchant's wife, who had once been his. It was closer to a debt paid to himself, installment by installment, each time he refused to look away from someone the world had decided was easier to ignore. The bench had held its silence a moment longer that morning before the sound of a hired buggy broke it, wheels turning too fast for the ruts of the main road, drawn by a horse that looked overfed in a town where little else was. The man who stepped down from it wore a coat too heavy for the season and a smile fitted to his face like a tool kept for a single purpose. He did not look toward the wheelwright at all. He looked at the widow the way a surveyor looks at a parcel of land he has already decided how to divide. He called her by her married name formally, as though the formality itself were a kind of leverage, and he opened a leather case that had clearly never carried anything but paper meant to unsettle people. Inside was a ledger page, and on it a figure, $60, owed for tool credit and seed advanced the previous spring, the ink of it fresh enough that the wheelwright, watching from 3 feet away with his coffee cooling in his hand, understood at once that freshness was not the same as truth. "Your husband's account was never settled before his passing," the collector said, and he said, passing the way other men said, convenience, a word chosen for its smoothness rather than its accuracy. "I've come to collect what's owed, or to arrange for the land to satisfy it. I'd prefer we settle it today, quietly, without troubling the town." It was not concern for her dignity that shaped the word quietly. The wheelwright heard the shape of it clearly enough. The collector had ridden past the mercantile earlier, had seen the way the boardwalk emptied when the widow crossed it, had understood in an instant what the town had taken 18 months to teach itself, and meant to use it. A woman nobody would stand beside was a woman nobody would witness for. He wanted her alone in her own kitchen with a paper and a pen, and he wanted the transaction finished before anyone thought to ask a single question about dates or amounts or where the money had gone. She did not sign. The wheelwright noted that first, before he noted anything else, that her hands stayed folded in her lap, that her voice, when it came, held steady in a way that told him this was not the first time in her life she had been handed a paper meant to frighten her into haste. "I'll want to see my husband's receipts," she said, "before I put my name to anything." "There's no need to trouble yourself with paper, ma'am. A woman in your position," the collector began, and let the sentence dissolve into something implied rather than spoken, the way men often did when the thing they meant was too plainly unkind to survive being said aloud. The wheelwright set his coffee down on the bench beside him, slowly, the way a man sets down a tool he intends to pick back up. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to, for the whole of the boardwalk had gone still in the particular way a room goes still when it senses that something true is about to be spoken, and truth, in a town starved for it, had a way of drawing silence around itself like a held breath. "I keep my own receipts," he said. "Every man who trades work for goods ought to. It saves arguments later, when memory gets convenient." It was not the collector's memory that concerned him. It was his own, reaching back 9 months to a spring morning when the wheat had barely broken the soil and Ezra Pratt had driven a broken-axled wagon into the yard behind the livery, apologizing for the inconvenience before he'd even climbed down, the way men did when they suspected they couldn't pay what a thing was worth. The wheelwright had looked at the axle and then at the man, thin as a fence rail and coughing in a way that even then had sounded like more than dust in the throat, and had named a price in wheat and seed corn rather than coin, because coin was the one thing Ezra plainly didn't have. They had settled it that way all that year, an axle for a bushel of wheat delivered at harvest, a wheel rim for 2 days' worth of Ezra's labor-mending fence, a plow blade sharpened in trade for seed corn Ezra had gotten cheap from a cousin in San Antonio. Small transactions, none of them large enough alone to matter, but the wheelwright had written each one down in a ledger he kept in the drawer beneath his workbench, dated in his own square hand, because his father had taught him that a man's word was only as good as his memory, and memory was a poor vault for anything a man meant to keep safe. He had not done it because he suspected he would ever need proof. He had done it because it was simply how he had always worked, the way another man might sharpen a blade before he needed it, out of habit rather than foresight. He thought of it now, sitting on the bench with his coffee going cold beside him, and felt something settle in his chest that was not quite triumph. It was too quiet for that, but was closer to the calm of a man who has already built the thing he will need before he knew he'd need it. The ledger was in the room above the livery, tucked behind a box of spare bolts. its pages recording a full year of an exchange far larger than $60. Honest work weighed against honest goods, each entry a small, plain fact that no amount of superstition or hurried paper could unmake. "I'll fetch my book," he said, standing, and did not wait to see whether the collector wished him to. 2 mornings before that quiet declaration, the bench outside the Mercantile had held a different weight altogether, and Louisa had come to it with her hands wrapped so tightly around her coffee cup that Gideon had noticed the whiteness of her knuckles before he noticed anything she said. She had not slept. That much was plain in the shadowed hollows beneath her eyes, and when she finally spoke it was not in the measured, careful way she usually offered her words, but in a rush, as though she had been holding the sentence back with both hands and could no longer manage the strain of it. "Silas Whitlock came to the cabin yesterday," she said. "He says Ezra owed him $60 in tool and seed credit, and he means to have the land if I can't pay it by week's end." Gideon had set his own cup down slowly, the way he set down anything he did not wish to spill through carelessness. $60, he repeated, not as a question but as a man turning a fact over to feel its edges. "He wants me to sign something, alone, tonight, if I'll let him come back." Her voice had dropped, and there was something in it he had not heard before. Not the flat composure she wore like a second skin, but a thin thread of fear pulled taut. "He knows what the town thinks of me. He said it plain, that no judge in the county would trouble himself over a widow folk already call unlucky." The wind had moved through the street then, stirring dust along the boardwalk, and Gideon had let the silence hold a moment longer than was comfortable, not from indecision, but because he wanted the words that followed to land with their full weight. "He won't need to trouble a judge," he said at last, "because there's no debt left to prove." She had looked at him sharply, and he had told her then, plainly, about the ledger, every trade of labor for goods, every repaired axle and mended plow set down against the seed and tools Ezra had taken on credit, a full accounting kept not out of suspicion but habit, the way his father had taught him. Her breath had caught, not with relief exactly, but with the particular ache of discovering that she had not been as unwatched, as unaccounted for, as she had believed. "Then we don't let him take you alone," Gideon had said, "and we don't let him take you quiet either. Whatever he means to say, he can say it where the whole street can hear him say it back." She had studied him a long moment, the fear in her easing by degrees, replaced by something steadier, something that looked almost like the first shape of trust fully formed. "Tomorrow then," she had said, "in front of the store." Morning came dressed in the same dust it always wore, but the street outside the Mercantile filled early, the way it did on auction days or when a stranger's wagon rattled through with news worth repeating. Word had gone around, the way word always went around in a town too small to keep its own secrets, and by the time the sun had climbed clear of the feed store's roof, a knot of onlookers had gathered along the boardwalk, shopkeepers in their aprons, ranch hands leaning against hitching posts, women drawn from their kitchens by a curiosity they would later deny to their husbands. He stood beside her, not in front of her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and when Whitlock arrived astride a horse too fine for a man of his trade, the collector's eyes moved over the crowd with the practiced calculation of a man who had planned for a private negotiation and found himself facing a public one instead. "This doesn't concern the whole town," Whitlock said, dismounting, his voice pitched for authority, though it carried a thread of unease beneath it. "It concerns whoever's owed money," Gideon answered, "and whoever's meant to pay it. Seems fair the street should hear the sum before you name it." He opened the ledger against the flat of his forearm, the pages soft from handling, the ink gone brown with age in places, and began to read, not with performance, but with the same plain cadence he might have used to call out board measurements. A wheel rim mended in March, set against 3 pounds of seed. An axle repaired in June, set against a plow blade sharpened and returned. Dates, names, sums, each one small enough to seem unremarkable alone, and together forming a record too complete to argue with. Whitlock's jaw tightened. Debts like that aren't legal tender. A man owes coin, not favors. A man owes what he agrees to owe, Gideon said, and your own name's signed here, on the corner of this page, as witness to the trade in September. He turned the ledger outward so the nearest onlookers could see the signature themselves, and a murmur passed through the crowd like wind through dry wheat. Whitlock's gaze flicked to Louisa, then to the gathered faces, searching for the old fear he had counted on, the whispers about misfortune that had always done half his work for him. But the faces watching him now were not afraid. They were merely waiting, and waiting for a man in his position was its own kind of verdict. He mounted his horse without another word, the leather creaking beneath him, and rode east out of Redemption Gulch without looking back, leaving behind only the settling dust and the sound of the crowd exhaling as one. Louisa did not move for a long moment. Then she turned to Gideon, and though she said nothing, her hand found his sleeve and held it. The dust had not yet finished settling when the shopkeeper stepped down from his own boardwalk, an unusual thing for a man who had spent 18 months finding reasons not to leave his counter when she came near, and he asked, in a voice pitched lower than his usual trade voice, whether she might want her flour weighed twice that week, given the heat. It was a small offer, almost nothing, and yet it landed in the street like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward long after the stone itself had sunk from sight. She thanked him plainly, without flourish, because flourish had never been her habit, and he nodded and returned to his ledgers looking faintly relieved, as though he had discharged some debt of his own that he could not have named aloud. In the days that followed, the town did not change so much as it exhaled, the held breath of 18 months finally released into ordinary air. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now offered brief good mornings, careful still, as though testing whether the ground beneath the old fear had truly hardened or might yet give way. Men who had haggled her down at the feed store began quoting fair prices without being asked twice. No one spoke of misfortune anymore, not where she could hear it, and if the word still moved in back rooms and kitchens, it moved quieter now, thinned by the memory of a ledger opened on a boardwalk and a debt collector's horse turning east without argument. Through it all, the bench outside the mercantile remained exactly where it had always stood, and each morning he arrived and sat, and each morning she came from the wheat field with dust on her hems and found him there, and neither of them remarked upon the fact that no one looked away anymore when they sat together. There was no need for the old caution, the sidelong glances measuring how much scandal the town could bear. They simply sat, as they always had, though now the sitting itself felt less like defiance and more like habit, the kind that accumulates so slowly a person forgets there was ever a time before it. He brought coffee some mornings, and she brought bread, and the exchange had stopped being a courtesy extended to a stranger and become something closer to routine between two people who had decided, without ceremony, to keep choosing each other's company. The wheel he had mended for her stood true in the barn, and the harness he had restitched held fast through the long days of harvest, and though neither of them spoke of what the summer had cost or what it had settled, the quiet between them now carried the particular ease of debts fully paid, and something else beginning, unspoken, to accrue in their place. The evening she set the second plate, she did so without deciding to, her hands moving through the motion before her mind had caught up to what they intended, and when she noticed what she had done, the two plates facing each other across the scrubbed pine table, the two cups, the bread already cut in two portions rather than one, she stood for a moment with her palm flat against the wood, as though steadying herself against the plainness of it. Outside, the light had gone the color of weak tea, the kind of light that came only in that hour before full dark when the heat finally released its hold on the land, and the wheat stood cut and gathered in the barn, and the debt was settled, and the town had stopped whispering the particular whisper that had followed her for 3 years, like a shadow she could not outrun. She had grown used to a different sound now, the creak of the gate a little after 6, the scrape of boots on the step, the knock that was not tentative anymore but familiar, a man's knuckles against wood he himself had once repaired. She heard it now, and she did not wait the way she once had, counting the seconds, weighing what his presence might cost her in the town's estimation. She crossed the room and opened the door before he had lowered his hand from the second knock, and he stood there in the fading light with his hat already off, as he always removed it before she asked, and something in her chest loosened at the ordinary sight of him. "Gideon," she said, and the name came out plain, unadorned by anything but certainty, the way a person says a word they have decided to trust. He looked at her, and then passed her shoulder to the table set for 2, and whatever he saw there he did not remark upon directly, though his eyes held on it a moment longer than they needed to. "Stay for supper," she said. It was not a question dressed as a question, not an offer extended out of obligation or pity, or the fair exchange that had first brought him to her land. It was simply a fact she was stating, the way she might have said the wheat was in, or the wheel held true, or the winter would be less hard than the one before it. He nodded and stepped inside, and the door closed behind him with the quiet, unremarkable sound of a door closing on an ordinary evening, no different, to anyone passing outside, from any other night in Redemption Gulch. But inside, at a table set deliberately for 2, something had shifted into place at last, not rescued, not granted, but chosen, plainly and without ceremony, by 2 people who had learned, slowly and honestly, how to sit beside each other and stay.